Hello. So if you've caught the past two episodes, you're going to be wondering if this has become some sort of animal series. But as my friends and family will tell you, my life's got a bit strange at times. So stick with me, and I promise this is the last animal themed episode for a little while. And this one's pretty likely to make you either burst out laughing or your jaw to hit the floor. So, as I just mentioned, I'm definitely an adventurous soul, and whilst I certainly don't crave drama, I'm always up for trying new things, meeting new people, and I'll help anyone however I can. And in this episode, I'm going to share the story of my relationship with birds. So, around 10 years ago, a family friend of ours went on holiday with her daughter and grandchildren, and her granddaughter kept her horse in a field just around the corner from my parents' house where I lived. And the family that she rented the field from were also visiting their family in France for the same week. Usually they'd have looked after the pony, but with everyone gone, our family friend asked if I would look after the horse. Now, I'd grown up in the countryside and I'd done a few horse riding lessons, and I hadn't had a horse of my own, but a few of my friends had. I was happy to pay the pony a visit after work every evening and have a little chat with her and replenish her hay whilst they were all on holiday. It was also summertime, so a little walk up the farm track and through the field on a warm evening was hardly much of a chore, so I was happy to help, and so that's what I did. I'd park my car by the chicken coop, have a little look in at the hens, and wander down the lane to the ponies field with a bag full of carrots and a bale of hay. But it was on day 4 that it all went a bit wrong. It was raining, so I drove straight there after work, and I mentioned that the family who lived in the farm cottage were away. Well, they hadn't arranged for anyone to feed these hens, and so it was when I arrived to tend to the pony that I realised there was something wrong with the chickens. I mean, it didn't take a lot of working out. As soon as I got out of my car, I was met by 12 very hangry hens, and despite me trying to outrun them to the stable to go and get the hay, they soon caught up with me, and they were only interested in one thing. I looked for the chicken feed everywhere. I shut myself in the stable, and whilst they scratched at the door, I was scratching around for something to satiate these starving hens with. So I took a deep breath and I opened the stable door, and the hens pecked at my feet, and I ran to the car and they chased me, and I was soaking wet and I was bloody terrified, and I still had to get out to open the gate so I could go home and get some birdseed. So I did what any other fully grown, albeit 21-year-old woman would do. I rang my dad. I told him that I needed birdseed and rescuing from these demented chickens who seemed hell-bent on taking out their abandonment issues on me, and my dad did just that. He bought a tub of birdseed and we tried to coax the hens back into the coop. And in what must have looked like a scene from a Carry On film, my dad and I fed the hens, rehoused them, and I was really shaken up by the whole thing. I'd been pecked a lot on my feet, my legs, my arms, my hands were all cut from their hungry beaks, and from that day forward I was scared of birds. All birds. Pigeons, ducks, canaries, ostriches, and definitely chickens. I was scared of them all. I developed this phobia at 21, and this was it. Everyone knew it and most people found it entertaining. And so on to the parrot. Well, this is where the story starts to get a bit strange. Let's fast forward 10 years of being too scared to sit on a picnic bench with my feet within pecking distance and avoiding feeding the ducks at every opportunity. By now, it was 4 months before I escaped from Mr. C. I'd just returned to our home after one of my retreats to my parents, and it was a Sunday morning. We were in the calm phase of what I now know to be the cycle of abuse. So he was love-bombing me and charming, he was caring and attentive. And I was scrolling through an app I had on my phone. It was a local community app, you know, the kind where you put a post to look for a gardener or report a missing cat. Well, there was a post from a lady who was looking for someone to punch an extra hole in her daughter's belt, and it instantly grabbed my attention because I'd been that young girl who needed an extra hole in her belt. And since things were good between Mr. C and I like to help wherever I can, I suggested that we went to this lady's house and helped her out. I suppose I presumed it was a woman on her own, and her daughter was desperate to wear the belt and she had no means to put a hole in it. They lived in the village and we were going out shopping, so it'd be absolutely no bother to swing by, pop a hole in the belt and then head on to the shops. So I responded to the post. She sent me her phone number and I called her to ask what her address was and arranged the time. So an hour or so later, we headed up to the house and we were sat outside the wrought iron gate she'd described and pressed the button for the intercom. The gates opened up and we headed up the drive. It was a long drive, and as we drove past the church on the right, this huge chill ran down my body and I felt like I'd been there before. We carried on up the tree-lined drive, and as it swept around the corner, a huge, and I mean huge, house revealed itself. We pulled up by the door and parked next to an outbuilding with Grandpa's workshop over the door, and the most beautiful woman with the most beautiful smile came out of the house and greeted us. It was as though we had been friends with this woman for years, and she warmly welcomed me, Mr. C and my daughter, and invited us into the entrance hall. Then her daughter and her husband came out to greet us, and we followed them into their huge kitchen. We chatted some more like long lost friends, and I was totally comfortable. I felt like I was at home. It was an unusual sensation. You know, I felt like, is this what home's meant to feel like? And after a cup of tea and more talking, I remembered why we were there. I looked at the daughter, who was stood next to me and wearing a thin black belt, and I asked her if this was the belt in question, and she said yes. She took it off. I had the hammer, the nail and the block of wood in my hand, and since she'd held her thumb in place where she wanted her new hole, I asked her to put it on the piece of wood. I lined up the nail and I gently hit it with the hammer to create the new hole. It was done in less than a moment, and her parents and Mr. C were still mid-conversation when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I heard a man shout at the top of his lungs, "Hello!" The room went silent, and Mr. C and I looked at each other, not sure what to think. My daughter was playing with a puppy on the floor, and even they both stopped what they were doing at this interruption. And then again, "Hello!" The couple smiled and chuckled. They could see that we were alarmed. And then the man looked straight at me. He looked me in the eye and he asked me, "Do you like parrots?" Now it was Mr. C's turn to laugh, and with a smirk and a sneer he said, "Oh no, Eve's scared of birds." And the man, let's call him John, said, "Really? Well, come and meet Herbie. There's nothing to be scared of." And so he opened the door to Herbie's room, which sat just off the kitchen, and there in this huge bird cage was a pure white parrot with a shiny coat and bright sparkly eyes. And John said to me, "Do you know that parrots are empaths? They reflect whatever energy they feel right back at you. It's like looking in an emotional mirror." And in that moment, I understood exactly what he meant. Like, I understood it truly and deeply, because that is exactly how I feel with other people and animals. And I knew what I needed to do. I took a deep breath and I calmed myself, and with that, the parrot ruffled its feathers and started to move towards me. I reached out and stroked its feathers and I said, "Hello, Herbie." And he said, "Hello, Herbie," straight back. And there I stood, in complete peace for a moment, pure tranquility washing over me, and time it stood still. I just couldn't tell you how long we were there. But Mr. C obviously didn't feel quite so comfortable in Herbie's presence, as that tranquility was broken when he declared that we needed to go. I mean, he was probably right. We didn't actually know these people after all. And so we started to edge to the door, and I looked at Herbie and I said, "Nice to meet you, Herbie." And he responded, "Nice to meet you, Herbie." And we left the room and John shut the door. And as we headed back towards the front door, Herbie continued to shout, "Hello, hello, hello." And I could still hear him in all the way to the car. The whole thing was so extraordinary, and I left that house feeling somehow different. Some might say I'd been awakened or enlightened, but I just deepened my connection to myself, and I spent a few moments at deep peace, and I really liked it. Mr. C was utterly perplexed by the whole encounter. The first thing he asked me when we got into the car was whether I knew those people, whether I'd set it up to demonstrate that empaths were real and they existed. I'd only heard the term empath myself a short while before this, whilst I was desperately searching Google for an explanation of what might be going on between Mr. C and I. Had stumbled across the term, and he was very sceptical, to say the least. But in that moment, my fear of birds disappeared, and it's been gone ever since. I've stroked chickens, fed ducks, and happily walked amongst peacocks without an ounce of fear. Because I changed that day. My whole attitude to life did as well. It wasn't the first spiritual experience I'd felt, and I'll share some of the others as we move through the series, but this one was important because from that day forward, I knew that Mr. C and I weren't the same at all. That all those promises and declarations that we were soulmates or destined to be together no matter what life threw at us, they were empty. And as the days that followed went on, I thought a lot about Herbie and just how symbolic the whole encounter had been. I had so many questions. Why did it feel like I'd been there before? Had I met that family before? What did Herbie see in me that made him so calm, so friendly, so talkative? Was this a loved one who had passed over, guiding me or trying to get a message to me? And how had I overcome such a deep-rooted fear so easily, so calmly, so naturally? And why did a couple who looked to be fit and able and had a whole outbuilding named Grandpa's Workshop need to put out an SOS call on a social media platform for someone to come round with a hammer and nail to put a hole in a belt? And why was I the one that had replied? I had so many questions. And one you're probably asking is, what has this got to do with this day 1 year ago? Well, as you know, I'd had the absolute bare minimum of contact with Mr. C since that day when I realised that nothing I ever said or did would have been good enough for him. And other than sending that list of possessions, the brief encounter as he dumped my daughter's toys and the dog on my parents' drive, and the message to ask him to stop harassing me, I was sticking to my self-imposed communication strategy and ignoring everything else. Now, that wasn't to say that he wasn't trying, and the term for this sort of behaviour is hoovering, because as the word suggests, it's about trying to suck you back in, and the ways in which an abuser will try to do this can be obscure, indirect, and often are an attempt to encourage a response. They might tell you that they're ill, that something's broken, they want to wish you happy birthday, send a generic text message and then say wrong number straight after. They might try and contact you out of the blue to ask how you are, or send you gifts, send you flowers, anything they can think of to provoke a response from you. And Mr. C had made a lot of attempts to hoover over the past week or so. But it was on this day a year ago that Mr. C made his most elaborate hoover attempt, because he sent me a message saying that he'd got something for me. And when I didn't reply, he sent me a picture taken in my old lounge, and there in front of the burnt orange wall was a large black cage containing, yep, you've guessed it, a parrot. And underneath it said, "This is Bernard." And I didn't reply. Thank you for watching, and if you have got an elaborate Hoover story, then please do share in the comments or drop me a little DM and I shall share it on your behalf. I hope you have a wonderful day and I shall see you soon. Bye bye.